The bailout, nobody announced. There was no press conference, no emergency vote, no headline declaring intervention. And yet, when the pressure peaked, collapse did not arrive. Something absorbed the shock quietly, efficiently, and without acknowledgement. To understand why this bailout mattered, we must return to a moment when intervention had become politically impossible. Public patience was thin. Trust was fragile. Any visible rescue risked backlash, legal challenge, and market panic. Doing nothing, however, risked systemic failure. The system needed help, but could not be seen receiving it. The first reveal appears in balance sheets that changed without explanation. Losses were not written off publicly. They were reclassified. Timelines extended. Valuations adjusted through assumptions rather than action. What looked like market movement was, in fact, space being created quietly for survival. The second beat followed as institutions coordinated without meeting. Enforcement slowed. Flexibility appeared where rigidity had been promised. Rules were not suspended, but they were interpreted generously, all at once. No directive was issued, yet behavior aligned. Pressure eased not because capital flooded in, but because demand softened simultaneously. What made this possible was shared understanding. Everyone involved recognized the stakes. Acting alone would expose them. Acting together openly would provoke resistance. So the system moved sideways instead of forward. Relief arrived disguised as normal operation. By the time observers realized stability had returned, there was nothing to point to. No transaction to audit. No decision to reverse. The bailout had occurred through absence rather than action. This was not rescue by declaration. It was rescue by discretion. And it worked precisely because no one could say it happened. As the reveal deepened, the mechanics of the quiet rescue became clearer to those inside the system. Nothing had been added. Nothing had been forgiven outright. Instead, time itself was extended. Deadlines loosened. Pressure points softened. What had threatened to break under immediacy was allowed to breathe. The conflict emerged in how unnatural this felt. Markets are built on clarity. Losses are supposed to surface. Failures are meant to be visible. Yet, visibility, in this moment, would have triggered exactly what everyone feared. Forced recognition would have cascaded through balance sheets, turning contained stress into open collapse. Silence became a stabilizer. The buildup intensified as institutions adjusted expectations internally. Risk assessments were revised without announcement. Stress scenarios were reweighted. What had been treated as imminent danger was reframed as manageable exposure. No single actor could have done this alone. But when everyone adjusted at once, the system recalibrated itself. This coordination was not ordered. It was inferred. Each participant watched others closely, searching for signals. When enforcement did not tighten, when flexibility appeared simultaneously across jurisdictions, a message spread without words. The system would absorb this. Quietly, critics would later argue this was avoidance, not resolution. And they would be right. The problems were not solved. They were postponed. But postponement, at that moment, was the difference between fracture and survival. The system needed continuity more than purity. What made this episode so unsettling was its effectiveness. A bailout had occurred without money changing hands, without votes, without explanation. Stability returned without accountability. The public saw calm. Inside, everyone knew how thin it was. By now, a deeper realization settled in. Modern systems do not always need capital to be rescued. Sometimes, they only need pressure to be removed at the same time. And when relief arrives through coordination rather than declaration, it leaves no record. Only the uneasy knowledge that collapse was avoided by choosing not to look too closely. The tension peaked when the quiet rescue began shaping future behavior. Once the system learned that collapse could be avoided without announcement, expectations shifted. Institutions took note. If pressure could be eased silently once, it might be eased again. Risk did not disappear. It recalculated. The conflict sharpened as moral boundaries blurred. Officially, discipline remained intact. Privately, everyone understood that enforcement could bend when consequences felt too large. This created a subtle imbalance. Those closest to the system's core sensed protection. Those further away still faced full exposure. Stability had been preserved, but unevenly. The buildup intensified when stress returned in smaller waves. Each time, the same pattern repeated. Flexibility appeared. Deadlines softened. Interpretation widened. No one called it a bailout, yet behavior adjusted as if one were expected. The system began relying on discretion rather than reform. Silence became a tool, not an exception. Inside policy circles, concern grew. Quiet rescues solved immediate danger, but they also eroded clarity. If failure could be postponed indefinitely, signals meant to enforce discipline weakened. Losses lingered unresolved. Weakness remained hidden. What had been an emergency tactic risked becoming structural habit. Public trust faced a quieter threat. People sensed outcomes were being managed without explanation. Crises ended without answers. Stability returned without accountability. Confidence held, but it rested on assumption rather than understanding. The absence of panic masked accumulation of doubt. By now, the paradox was unavoidable. The bailout nobody announced had worked, but its success carried a cost. Each silent rescue made the next one harder to deny and easier to expect. Discretion preserved order, yet undermined transparency. Survival had been purchased with silence. The system stood intact, but it was standing on decisions no one could point to, and that made its future more fragile than it appeared. The reckoning arrived when silence itself became visible, not through exposure of a single act, but through repetition. Patterns were recognized, behaviors predicted. What had once looked like coincidence now looked like design. The system had learned to rescue itself quietly, and that knowledge could not be undone. The climax unfolded as policymakers confronted a difficult truth. Discretion was necessary in moments of danger, but discretion without boundary becomes expectation. Quiet rescues protected stability in the short term, yet weakened credibility over time. Markets began assuming flexibility. Discipline lost its edge. The line between tolerance and guarantee blurred. This realization forced change, not dramatic, but deliberate. Authorities began narrowing discretion rather than denying it. Flexibility was framed openly as temporary relief, not invisible rescue. Timelines were clarified. Limits were communicated without spectacle. Silence would no longer pretend to be absence. The resolution followed gradually. The system did not abandon quiet coordination, but it stopped relying on it as default. Stability was supported by clearer frameworks, not implied forgiveness. The goal was not to eliminate discretion, but to prevent it from becoming an unspoken promise. What endured from the bailout, nobody announced, was a sobering lesson. Systems can survive without transparency once. They cannot build trust that way repeatedly. Stability achieved through silence carries hidden debt. Eventually, that debt demands explanation. Europe avoided collapse by choosing not to speak. It preserved legitimacy by learning when to speak again. Subscribe to join the journey. The